नमस्कार, मैं आपका सीए दोस्त मनमोहन जिंदल. We shall discuss today on the reverse factoring. So, in the earlier videos, we have discussed about the factoring. Reverse factoring is the reverse of the factoring. So, factoring is a good business nowadays, which are undertaken by the banks as well as the NBFCs. It's a profitable business, that is fee-based business, and also beneficial to the seller and the purchasers. So factoring means of a funding of accounts receivable against assignment in favor of a factor. Factoring helps to generate instant liquidity and allows business continuity without disruption. In simple words, it is a receivable management and financing service designed to accelerate the seller's cash flow. So, in the process, his purchasing power increases, production moves up, sales turnover and profitability improves. So there are two parties, that is buyer and seller. So when seller sells his goods to the buyer on credit, it means he has to receive the money from the buyer, and it creates receivables in the balance sheet of the seller. So seller used to factor these receivables from a NBFCs or a bank called the factor and get the money earlier, and the bank will be paid off this amount by the buyer on the due date of the bill. Hence, it's a sell-liquidated bill, and the bank on discount, seller gets the early money, buyers giving the money on the due date. So these are the benefits. Now, the reverse of the factoring is called reverse factoring. So reverse factoring, also known as the supply chain finance or approved payable finance, that is initiated by the buyer for commercial transaction. So the transaction initiated by the buyer to fund the seller instead of the seller to fund for himself. So why the arrangement of reverse factoring is because of the vicious circle of the transactions. We see that buyers rely on goods from the suppliers to make their end products. It is compulsion, which of course drives the buyer's revenue. Buyer is dependent on the supplier. Unreliable or financially unhealthy supplier can cause revenue problem for the buyers. So if the product is very, very crucial and his seller is little bit weak, his seller is not in a position to supply the buyer in uninterrupted, or he is a financially healthy, then buyer used to help him through the reverse factoring. And seller rely on the buyers to pay for their purchases so they can continue funding their operations. On the other side, seller is also dependent on the buyer that he should get the early money and keep his production going on, because he has to pay to the raw material, labor, or so many other expenses. So in reverse factoring arrangement, a third party means either banks or NBFCs, financial helps or grease the wheels, keeping the circle going on turn. Financial partners are banks or other financial that pay a buyer's accounts payable on the buyer's behalf. Here, the goodwill is seen by the bank or the NBFCs of the buyer. So, what the buyer has to pay to the seller, that is discounted by the factor. So, supplier gets paid more quickly, buyer gets more time to repay the partner, and partner collects fees and interest. The win-win situation for all the three parties. So, all the three parties are benefited. So, how it works? So reverse factoring helps cash flow of both a buyer and its suppliers. Supplier gets money early and buyer have to pay the amount of the due date after some time using the third party financial, meaning the bank or the NBFCs. From the buyer standpoint, it gets short-term loan from the financing partner since they pay the supplier early and the buyer pays the later. So it's a arrangement of short-term finance bill based that the bank discount the payable of the buyer and pays the money to the supplier. So supplier gets the early money. And financing partner views the transaction much as financial institution would earning income from fees and interest. So it is only a repetition which we have already discussed earlier. So these parts evaluate credit worthiness of the buyer. We see that in the factor, bank sees the creditworthiness of the seller. But here, it is creditworthiness of a buyer. When entering into a reverse factoring arrangement, and since buyer is responsible for paying back the invoice to the partner. So here, bank has to get the money from the buyer. So reverse factoring speeds up the supplier ability to collect its sales. सो सप्लायर को तो पहले ही पैसा मिल जाता है, उसकी सारी की एफर्ट सारा बच जाता है, उसका सारा का सारा काम बच जाता है, उसकी रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी भी नहीं है बाद में पे करने की, द पे तो बायर को करना है. So this is the chart I have taken from common media. Here you see that buyer makes the purchase, seller supplies the product, sellers, and seller sends invoice to the buyer. यहाँ पर seller ने invoice बेचा buyer को because buyer has purchased the goods from the supplier. So buyer approves that invoice sends it to the buyer. तो बायर कहता है ठीक है भाई ये बिल ठीक है जो तुमने मुझे भेजा है, सप्लाई मेरे पास आई है, इसका आपने मूल्य बिल भेजा है, तो मैं इस बिल की पेमेंट करूंगा आफ्टर द ड्यू डेट से ईयर 90 days or 45 days just in MSME or 120 whatever it is. So buyer has to pay the amount after 90 days. But suppliers needs money early, so buyer sends this invoice to the factor, his own factor means his own bank or NBFC, which pays the money to the seller. And seller gets money here, and after the due date of the invoice, buyers pays to the factor. Hence, the circle is. So there are 5 steps into the process which we have discussed. Buyer places an order with a supplier. Seller fulfills the order, bills the buyer to creating an invoice using its normal payment terms. The invoice sometimes includes a discount for paying early but not always. ठीक है. Buyer approves the invoice, acknowledges validity, obligation to pay, or here he sends the bill to the financing partner, authorizing payment in accordance with the buyer contract. the most often it is done electronically. तो बैंक को वो इंस्ट्रक्शंस देता है, बैंक को वो ऑर्डर मतलब एडवाइस करता है कि ये पेमेंट आप सेलर को दे दी. So finance partner then pays the supplier, taking the advantage of an early payment discount, typically by depositing funds into the supplier's bank account. तो supplier के बैंक अकाउंट में उसकी पेमेंट 2 या 3 दिन में ही चली जाती है और उसके बाद उसकी जिम्मेदारी नहीं रहती. Then the headache is of the buyer. He has to pay the money to the bank. On the due date of the invoice or an agreed future date, the buyer pays the factor and closing the transaction, the circle is complete. So it is a 5-step process in a reverse factor. So why it is important? Why it is so important? And we have discussed the reverse factoring. So there is something importance. So reverse factoring, especially well suited for situations where the salary is small and medium sized business. You see that in MSME we have to pay the payment to the MSME within 45. So small seller is not having the risk appetite or working capital appetite or he is not having so much funds that he can continue the supply, but buyer is dependent on that because he is getting the cheap goods from the supplier. And buyer is a large and established company. Here, buyer is a reputed person and he has a lot of influences on the bank and have a very credit limits or is a good customer of the banks. The seller can estimate its cash flow relying on the reverse factoring agreement, which is based on the credit worthiness of the buyer. It is important that it is the credit worthiness of the buyer rather than the seller's own credit worthiness. So small seller is very small person, medium class person, SME, micro person. So he is not having so much credit worthiness in the bank. He is not in a position to get the loan or finance or discount of bill from the bank. So here buyer helps him and pays early through the factor so that his supply can be non-interrupted. So without reverse factoring, a large buyer could delay payment to the seller up to the limit of the invoice terms or even longer, potentially creating a cash crunch to the seller. So if a large buyer say that I will pay to the small seller after 120 days, 90 days, 45 days, so seller sometimes not in a position to pop up with that time, his industry can be shut up or can be delayed and production cannot be continued. Earlier, hence the buyer is also affected for that. So what the invoice is given by the seller, it may create the cash crunch for the seller because he's not getting in the time and in the process by reverse factoring, sellers can receive payment in time and avoid the situation that he can create its own line of credit if he is in a position to in a by paying a higher interest. So sometimes micro lending is more costly than the corporate funding. So what are the benefits to the buyer? So buyer profile a reliable customer which can lead to favorable purchase terms. Buyer क्योंकि बड़ा आदमी है, कॉर्पोरेट है, तो वह अपनी टर्म्स एंड कंडीशंस रखता है और पेमेंट को कई बार डिले करता है और इसलिए उसको फैक्टर का सहारा लेना पड़ता है ताकि उसका सेलर भी अनइंटरप्टेड सप्लाई करता रहे. बाय फैक्टरिंग उसको इमीडिएटली कैश से डिपार्ट नहीं होना पड़ता एंड ही कैन फेवर हिज वेंडर थ्रू फाइनेंशियली हेल्प improving availability of the needed supplies and financial metrics or other data arrangements can be taken in a very beneficial manner. Now there are also supplier side. Here also the benefit we have discussed earlier also in these slides, that he received the payment on sales after 2 to 3 days, much quicker than the stipulated by the invoice payment terms. Suppose invoice terms payment is after 90 days, but he gets his money after 2 to 3 days, so he has to pay some cash discount. Volume of collection efforts and bad debts. So when he has get his amount immediately after 2 3 days, bad debt problem solved, collection problem solved, and fees are reduced because they are based on buyer's better credit rating. Buyer is in a position to negotiate with the bank, get its fees lesser than the seller, which is not having the so good terms and not the negotiation skills with the banker. So provides faster, cheaper funding for continued operations and increase accuracy of cash flow for us. Because buyer is a good person, corporate, so he is having the more liberty in the society than the supplier. So this is on the reverse factoring. I hope that it will every banker, every NBFC person, every businessman, every MSME person, chartered accountant, company secretary, CMAs, or the lecturers, students should know about these jargons of factoring and reverse factoring. So बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद. नमस्कार.